Great, so I can see a few people have joined, so perhaps we can make a start, and I'm sure others will be joining over the next few minutes. But just say a warm welcome to this webinar given by Remap Consulting on NICE's proportionate approach to technology appraisals, or as we'll be referring to throughout this presentation, PATT, P-A-T-T. NICE tends to be a fan of acronyms, and this is no exception. From our point of view, this is a really exciting topic, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do a webinar on it. It represents a big change, arguably bigger than NICE's methods update published in 2022, where some changes were made, but this potentially represents more of a fundamental shift, particularly in terms of some of the elements of the PATT that are being discussed, and my colleague Fatima will talk to that in more detail. And I think it's also important to say that NICE has confirmed that PATT is here to stay. It's not going anywhere. They're further developing it. And so, yeah, we feel this is a very important topic. Things are also somewhat in flux regarding this. There have been developments ongoing. NICE is currently in a later phase. So, yeah, things are fluid around this topic. And just to say, if you do have any questions at any point during the webinar, just drop them in the chat function, and we'll make sure to address them either as we go or at the end. And we have received some questions in the build up to this webinar, so thank you for that, and we'll aim to address those as part of our presentation today. So who are the presenters today? Well, my name is Charlie Hewitt. I'm a director at Remap Consulting. I've been working in pricing and market access for around 7 years, with 2 of those spent in the technical team at NICE, where I worked across various indications, including oncology, kidney disease, cardiovascular disease. I also was at NICE while some of the early discussions around the PATT were ongoing. Fatima, could you briefly introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. Good afternoon, everyone. As Charlie said, welcome to this webinar. My name is Fatima Chunara. I'm an associate director in the team. Similar to Charlie, I also have experience within NICE's Technology Appraisals team. So I worked across various indications, including oncology and non-oncology topics, both within the normal SDA process and also the HST process. And like Charlie, I was also within the NICE team once PATT was in its early phases, and was involved in some of the pilot phases as well. Thank you.
Great. It's also important to say that everything in this, all the content on the slides here reflects our own opinions and publicly available information. They don't reflect those of NICE themselves. So briefly, if you haven't yet heard of Remap Consulting, we're a pricing market access consultancy focusing on 3 main areas, those being launch pricing and access strategy, which includes both the strategic element, but also the implementation as well. We also do training, and that's one of the reasons why we're doing these webinars, to upskill people in topics that we consider important in the current landscape of market access. And finally, price optimization, so we can support with developing pricing strategies, the evidence needed to get that price, and also post-launch, how price can be optimized throughout the life cycle. We tend to work with people who are asking themselves if they have the optimal price for their product, if they have the right evidence to support that price and access at launch, do they have the right capabilities to train people on market access, and finally, if they're looking at in-licensing or out-licensing opportunities, what is the pricing market access potential for that asset? As I said, thank you for the questions beforehand. If you have any further ones throughout, then please let us know and we can try to address them. So what we'll cover today is 4 main areas. The first is the build up to PATT, so the background to NICE and the reasons we feel that they're introducing this initiative. Fatima will then talk to what's been happening over the last year or so in relation to the 2 phases of PATT, and then I'll finally cover what we feel the implications are, both for NICE itself and also for industry as well. So a bit of background on NICE. It launched in 1999, so it's been around for about 20 to 25 years or so. And it was created with the aim of dealing with the postcode lottery in England. So prior to NICE, patients could get access to different treatments in an unequal manner across England. So NICE was created to try to address that rather than saving the NHS money, which is often thought to be the case. Its founding principles are producing robust, inclusive, transparent, independent, and contestable guidance. NICE has several directorates and produces quite a wide range of guidance, including clinical guidelines, technology appraisals, diagnostics and medical technologies guidance, all these sorts of things. And here we're focusing on technology appraisals specifically, which is where NICE provides recommendations on the use of new and existing medicines and treatments in the NHS. NICE bases its recommendations on a review of the drug's clinical and economic evidence, so how well the medicine works and whether it represents value for money for the NHS. And as I'm sure many people will know on this webinar, that NICE has a threshold of 20 to 30,000 pounds per QALY, higher for very rare diseases in the HST programme. And generally speaking, NICE makes a decision based on the cost per QALY, although it does take other factors into account. And when it was created, NICE was a bit of a game changer. We included a quote there from the ABPI talking about the change and the radical change that the first appraisal NICE did represented. Over the years, NICE has had to constantly evolve to respond to a changing landscape. Initially, it only published kind of combined appraisals for the first few years of its existence. Now, looking at technologies one by one is the norm. NICE is widely considered a gold standard HTA body, but it has had to adapt to changes. And many of the changes we've highlighted on this slide have a particular impact on NICE's capacity to produce guidance. So either they increase the amount of guidance NICE is going to have to produce, or they are aimed at making NICE more efficient and able to produce more guidance. So we've pulled out the Cancer Drugs Fund, which allowed more faster access to new cancer drugs in 2016. It's been widely used. The most recent CDF list is 200 plus pages long, and this has likely increased the number of cancer appraisals NICE has to look at. In 2017, a budget impact test was introduced whereby drugs that exceeded a 20 million threshold after launch would have to negotiate further discounts. But perhaps more importantly for this webinar, NICE introduced the fast track appraisal in 2017 as well. This was aimed at providing quicker appraisal times for lower risk medicines, and with the aim of also giving quicker funding once NICE does make a positive recommendation. In 2018, NICE introduced technical engagement with the aim of trying to resolve some committee meetings ahead of the committee to try to speed up the process of the committee reviewing a drug. And in 2019, in the context of the voluntary scheme agreement, NICE, its remit expanded so that it would have to praise all new medicines or significant indication expansion. So this has substantially increased the number of topics NICE would need to look at. In 2022, I've also mentioned the new methods, but this expansion of the NICE remit, the expansion of the number of topics it would need to look at, has in part led to this introduction of PATT this year. NICE is facing, as I've alluded to, their resource constraints and also wider external changes and factors in the healthcare landscape. I've already talked about the expansion of the remit. COVID-19 also impacted NICE in that many topics were delayed. And also NICE had to refocus its efforts to produce guidance specifically relating to COVID-19, which meant that there's around 25% fewer appraisals were published in 2020 versus earlier years. There's also an increasing number of complex appraisals that NICE need to look at. And importantly, there's also a limited number of external assessment group or EAG and committee time slots. NICE did recently bring a new AG on board, but the committee, the number of committees has remained fairly consistent, and they can only meet so many numbers of times and look at so many numbers of topics. So this remains a bit of a rate limiter in terms of what NICE can look at. NICE also doesn't operate in a vacuum. So we've highlighted the impact of Brexit. So the fact that companies need to go through the MHRA approval as opposed to the EMA represents an extra hurdle. And there is some evidence that the UK regulatory decisions have been delayed compared with the EMA. We've talked a bit about the EU HTA in previous webinars we've done, but this adds some uncertainty around the UK because it's not clear how NICE will sit in relation to the joint clinical assessment done in the context of the EU HTA. And generally, some of the other changes we've highlighted here have potentially reduce the attractiveness of the UK in terms of a launch market. So the VPAS agreement, there's been some back and forth between the NHS and the industry around the clawback rates, but in general, the industry response has been negative. And these changes have all led to a growing number of non-submissions to NICE. This may reflect difficulties in showing cost effectiveness, difficulties in terms of the cost of making submissions and these sorts of things. However, NICE does expect the number of topics that it's looking at to exceed 100 in future years. Here we have a graph showing the number of topics NICE has looked at over the last 20 years or so, and you can see it's generally increasing over time. NICE has noted that many of its appraisals are for really the same set of drugs and across the same disease areas. So in particular, around 15% of the appraisals it's done have been for the PDL1 checkpoint inhibitors alone across a range of indications, and more than 40% of appraisals were across only 10 disease areas. So given this, NICE has asked the question, does it make sense to keep using the same process over and over again when they've looked at the same disease areas multiple times, they've looked at the same drugs multiple times? Just going back to fast track appraisals, these were introduced in 2017 to try to resolve some of these resourcing issues, but they've hardly been used. So you can see on this graph, in the last 3 years or so, 96% of appraisals were done through the standard process, 4% were fast track appraisals. We feel this is probably because the fast track appraisal didn't end up actually speeding up the process for the company. It still took the same length of time. It still required a committee slot, albeit a shortened one. So it did save a bit of committee time, but not as much as may have been hoped. And also it was risky because the company, if it was rejected to go down this route, it would have to resubmit to NICE with a full submission, a full model, and it would have to be rescheduled back into their work program, which would delay access to treatments. As I was alluding to earlier, NICE has obviously a finite number of committees. It has 4 committees as well as an HST committee to look at rare drugs. Each of these tend to meet once a month and will generally be able to look at 3 things per meeting. In general, on average, a topic might need more than 1 meeting to get a final decision from NICE. So if we're seeing 1.5 meetings, this gives a capacity of around 96 topics a year. If you contrast this with what NICE is predicting of 110, then it suggests that there simply isn't enough committee capacity to be able to look at all these appraisals, which is one of the reasons why NICE is really focusing on trying to make decisions outside of a full committee, which is what Fatima will also talk to shortly. So this comes to PATT. So what does it want to achieve? Well, NICE has cited that the aims of this approach are to increase NICE's capacity for publishing appraisals by 20% from 23 to 24, to allow evaluations to follow different paths that match their specific needs. So this is where we're talking about the proportional approach. Some drugs may need a lighter touch, as NICE tend to phrase it, and some may need a more complex, full appraisal. NICE has taken a test and learn approach to exploring these different approaches, and they've consulted heavily with industry and with other stakeholders during the development of these processes. And ultimately, the aim is both to make things more efficient for NICE, but also to enable faster patient access as well. So with that, I'll hand over to Fatima, who will talk through some of what NICE has done so far in relation to PATT and also their plans in the future.
Thank you, Charlie. Okay, so if we just go on to the next slide, I'll talk around a bit about the background to PATT and then also each of the changes. So PATT is something that NICE started thinking about as they were drawing towards the end of the new methods coming into play. And then in June 2022, they announced the concept of PATT publicly. So essentially, they announced to industry and on their website that they were thinking of launching this more streamlined or proportionate approach to their technology appraisals, and that they wanted to do this through a test and learn approach. This was slightly different to their previous changes that they've implemented, in that they wanted to do this through trialing out new methods, immediately taking things through and kind of amending as they went through the process, rather than coming up with an idea and kind of drawing out the process until it's released. In April of this year, they released a final report on PATT and also an interim methods document which outlined the outcomes of phase 1 of PATT. They also did a short consultation on this in July of this year, and the idea is that the outcomes of phase 1 of PATT will be incorporated into their full methods next year. They've also decided to continue PATT, so the outcomes from phase 1 were quite favorable. They saw some resource savings, which we'll talk about later, and so they've decided to introduce phase 2 of PATT, which is currently ongoing and which we'll talk on a bit later. So if we just go on to so phase 1 of PATT essentially covered several areas, which NICE grouped into 3 specific areas: streamlined approaches, operating efficiently, and exploratory findings. Within streamlined approaches, they looked specifically at cost comparison. So this is a slightly new way of doing cost comparison compared to what NICE has done previously. Streamlined decision making, which is completely new to them. And then under operating efficiently, they decided to completely remove technical engagement. So this is something that was introduced a few years ago with the idea of increasing efficiency. It didn't really work in practice, and so now NICE has essentially removed it from their processes. They also looked at paired appraisals and handling confidential information. And then under exploratory findings, they introduced or began trialing out pathways appraisals. This last one is quite complex. It has the potential to make really significant changes for NICE. So due to the complexity, they've decided not to finish it in phase 1 and are continuing that one into phase 2. There was also an earlier, just on the previous slide, there was also an earlier kind of aspect of PATT called the pre-specified assumptions. But because NICE is taking this test and learn approach as they're developing something, if it's not looking to be feasible, they're essentially terminating it, which is what happened with pre-specified assumptions. So if we move on. So this slide is just to give a bit of an overview of what has been the traditional NICE approach for the last few years. So since 2019, most kind of topics would go through a normal submission. The academic group would review it, and they would then go through technical engagement. So technical engagement was a period where companies could respond to the key academic group issues, and the idea was theoretically that issues would be resolved before the first committee meeting, and that theoretically you wouldn't need a second committee meeting in that case. But both from my experience and Charlie's experience at NICE, that really wasn't working in practice. So topics would go to technical engagement, companies would respond to the issues. Generally, there wouldn't be enough of a move to say those issues are resolved, and we would still go to committee meetings with many of these issues unresolved. So if we have a look at the data on how many meetings were actually being needed, around 50% of topics, even after technical engagement was introduced, still needed at least 2 meetings. So one of the aspects of PATT is to try and change this route so that each appraisal would go through an individual route, and it would be differentiated depending on whether the topic was more complex and needed the full process, or more simple and wouldn't need each of these full steps. So with the new PATT methods, they essentially have introduced two specific routing points. So we've got a star there next to scoping, and also one at the technical engagement, well, before technical engagement. So essentially, under the new processes at both scoping and after the EAG report has been received, NICE can make a decision on what routing a product undergoes. So I'll first briefly just introduce the idea of cost comparison. So under the new PATT methods, at the scoping stage, a decision can be made to route a topic to cost comparison. This is slightly different to the previous fast-tracked cost comparison approach that Charlie introduced. So previously, it would be up to the company to put a case forward to say that they met the criteria for cost comparison. They would have to kind of take that risky approach of doing a cost comparison submission. NICE would do a scrutiny of this and then decide whether it was suitable for cost comparison or not. With this new methods at the scoping stage, it will be NICE that makes that decision and lets the company know whether it's suitable or not for the cost comparison approach. The second routing option on the next slide is after the EAG report has been received. So once an EAG report has been received, NICE will actually then look at the report and make a decision on whether the topic can go under a standard STA process where there is no technical engagement as default, whether they think actually there is benefits to having technical engagement, and so the process is lengthened slightly, or whether they think that the ICEs are looking so positive that they can streamline this approach and it doesn't need to go through the full process. In red, we also have an option for NICE to pause the appraisal. So this was something that was introduced with the new methods. In cases where ICEs are essentially looking very not cost effective in both the EAG base case and the company base case. And NICE really thinks that even with resolving issues, it just wouldn't be feasible for this product to be cost effective. They may decide to pause the topic and consider the most appropriate action before continuing down with the appraisal. Okay, so we'll now go through each of these in a bit more detail, and we also have a few case studies in between. So for cost comparison, NICE will, as I say, identify this at the scoping stage, and they'll also start to make use of their medicines optimization team. So this is a team that's mainly made up of pharmacists, and what NICE will, the technology appraisals team will ask them to do is to look at the current treatment pathway, the current options that are being used, and how similar this is to the new technology being introduced. So the medicines optimization team will essentially produce a short report giving the technology appraisals team a recommendation on whether they think cost comparison is suitable or not. If cost comparison is suitable, then a simplified evidence submission can be submitted, and also a kind of shortened academic review would take place. A few other things to note on this is that the comparators in cost comparison must be previously have been recommended by NICE for the same population. So in cases where there is standard of care that hasn't been looked at by NICE, this wouldn't be suitable for cost comparison. And then where the real savings come from for NICE is for topics that go down cost comparison, there won't be a formal usual full committee meeting. Instead, the recommendation will be made by a subset of the committee. So typically it would be the chair and 3 lead team members, so a clinical lead, a cost lead, and a lay lead, and they will look at the kind of topic and make a decision on whether to recommend this or not outside a full committee meeting. The process will be around 23 weeks, which is 30% faster than the old FDA process and 45% faster than the usual SDA process. I think I see that we've got a comment there around ERG versus EAG. So just to say that with the new methods that were introduced last year, NICE kind of went through various changes in their acronyms and namings of processes, and one of those changes was changing ERG to EAG. So that would be the terminology they're using going forward. So in terms of pilots, there were two main pilots, TA863 and TA868, that looked at cost comparison, and we can go into a bit more detail on one of these in the next slide. Okay, so this was a kind of case study where you can see the medicines optimization team did their report. They looked at whether there was clinical efficacy and safety data that was similar to the existing products. They looked at the mechanism of action of the products. They looked at differences in the safety profiles and how these products are delivered from a service perspective, and also the clinical positioning. And they then added that a full SDA was unlikely to add value and a cost comparison would be suitable. What's really interesting about this topic is the original product, patisiran, underwent a full HST appraisal, so that's a lot more intensive, whereas patisiran essentially was able to do a cost comparison approach. So, and it's essentially an STA versus a HST product. The appraisal took around 5 months, and you can see from there around the document lengths that the final guidance document was only 4 pages long. So without going through a full committee meeting, they were able to really shorten all the documents, the submission, the academic report, and also the final guidance document. If we just go on to the next slide. So this is around technical engagement. So NICE previously, with their new methods, tried to say that technical engagement is optional, but that was more as a default, it was included and you could opt out if you wanted to, but generally companies chose to go through technical engagement. With the new PATT process, all topics will not have technical engagement scheduled in. And it will only be introduced if NICE itself thinks that there is going to be benefits for having technical engagement. And in that case, if it is seen as being needed, there'll be an impact on a company's timelines, and their appraisal committee meeting is very likely to be delayed slightly to allow extra time for technical engagement. But essentially, this is a way of trying to get back efficiencies that technical engagement wasn't showing. Okay, so another new aspect is the streamlined approach. So this is something that NICE will decide 2 weeks post the EAG report. And this is for cases where the ICEs are looking very low. So we've put there that they're below the lower end of the threshold, but generally they'll be a lot lower than that 20,000 threshold. And it's also in cases where there's low likelihood of decision error and consequences of this. So the budget impact wouldn't be close to the threshold. It wouldn't be a very complex topic. There'd be limited uncertainties. And NICE would also look at the impact of streamlining on resources. So if they streamlined this, what would be the impact on NICE itself, the committee, other stakeholders? How ready is the NHS to introduce this new technology? Is there similar technologies already in place? Is this likely to be something that's controversial? And if it is looking like an easy decision, the threshold, the ICEs are way below the threshold, and it's not looking to be a really complex topic, then NICE will streamline the topic to, again, a subset of the committee. So similar to cost comparison, it would be the chair and the lead team that make a decision without going to the full committee meeting. NICE said that this would be 10 weeks faster than the typical STA process, so it would be around 30 weeks rather than 44 weeks. And just as an example for TA876, so this was nivolumab, which NICE has a lot of experience in, and we have a few of the ICEs there. So these are from the publicly available documents, so that the actual ICEs might be different, but you can see there that the ICEs are very low. So versus surgery, it was around £2,000, and nivolumab also dominated other comparators as well. So that makes it very easy for NICE to say, we don't need to go to a full committee meeting. Let's just make a decision with the chair and the lead team and get this guidance out quicker. In this case, the final process took around 7 months, and you can see there a quote from the final guidance, which essentially says the likelihood of decision error was assessed to be minimal, which is, it's really in these sort of cases where the streamlined approach can be used.
Just to say, for those who don't know, dominant means that it was both cheaper and more effective.
Yep, thanks, Charlie. Okay, so paired appraisals. So these are another kind of aspect that NICE have introduced with PATT. It's not one that's as innovative as some of the others, but it's for cases where there's multiple, usually pairs of appraisals that are in the same indication and undergoing same timelines or similar timelines. And in this case, NICE can say, we'll have consistent NICE technical teams, we can have consistent clinical experts, the same EAG on the topic, and the most significant change, having a joint committee meeting. So in the committee meeting, NICE would have one set of slides. They would have the same introductory slides with the same disease background, same expert input, and then it would go into specific issues related to each of the topics. Importantly, paired technologies are not compared to each other, so it's still two individual submissions, two individual models, two individual guidance documents. It's just the case that they would both be seen at the committee at the same day, and internally within the NICE team, there would be consistent teams, and that really reduces the need for replication and also makes sure that there is consistency in approach across both appraisals.
Yeah, just from my perspective, and I think you'd agree, Fatima, I think this is quite a positive change because certainly I worked on appraisals where one would be going to a committee in 1 month, and then another one in exactly the same disease area would be going to a different committee in a different month. And so trying to get that alignment, I think, is a very positive development.
Yep. Yeah, I completely agree with that. And this case study is quite an interesting example. So this is the first time that NICE tried to do this paired approach more formally. So dapagliflozin and empagliflozin both had a combined ACM1 in January. Neither product was recommended, and they both went to an ACM2, which was again combined in April 2023. At this stage, only one of the products was recommended for use and the other one wasn't recommended. So AstraZeneca then, sorry, not AstraZeneca, Boehringer needed to do, actually, I think that's right. Boehringer needed to do another submission. And what essentially happened was NICE ended up updating the scope. So even though originally neither of these products were comparators to each other, and they went through this paired approach with both being STAs, because one of them was recommended earlier than the other, dapagliflozin essentially became a relevant comparator. And there was then a cost comparison for apagliflozin, which was only recommended this month. So this was quite an interesting example, but it's also just something worth noting is that there was some feedback from the companies involved that they thought that this approach needed some more refinement. So although officially these products shouldn't be compared to each other, some of the feedback received was that the committees seeing both together, there are kind of comparisons being made during the meeting, which might influence opinions on how a topic is being looked at. NICE has taken this feedback on board. They've said that they are reviewing the paired appraisal approach, and when this is introduced into the full methods update, then they will see how this can be reduced. I've seen that we also have a question on how this differs from an MTA. So the main difference from being an MTA is the companies in this case still develop their own individual models. In an MTA, it's normally the EAG that would develop the model, and each of the products are essentially compared to each other as well, whereas these are individual company submissions, individual models. So it's exactly the same from a company's perspective in their submission, and it's more on the NICE side, NICE internal team that there's changes. Okay, so if we go on to the next section, so the next section is looking at the phase 2 of PATT and the additional approaches that are being explored. So phase 2 includes a continuation of the pathways approach, which was initiated in phase 1 but couldn't be completed. It's also looking at rapid entry to managed access, high value steps, and products with many indications. So the pathways approach is one that could potentially have major implications for how NICE does things. It is something that's still being refined. So some of this that's on the slide is likely or could potentially change. But where it really comes from is, as Charlie mentioned, 40% of NICE appraisals are in 10 indications. So many NICE topics are covering renal cell carcinoma, non-small cell cancer, and multiple myeloma. So NICE is considering how to consolidate all of this to be able to develop more dynamic guidance and essentially use disease-based models instead of having individual models. Part of this is because when they are doing, for example, multiple topics in RCC, each company might have a slightly different model, a slightly different approach to things, and the committee is then having to try to remain consistent, but it's essentially because of the number, it makes it quite inefficient way of doing things. So there's essentially three steps to pathways. The first step is scoping and preparatory work. So instead of the usual short scoping workshop that's very focused on one specific drug, this is a much longer scoping workshop, normally around half a day. It has a wider range of stakeholders invited, so the EAG would be invited, and companies who have products already available in this disease area would also be invited to the scoping workshop. And the main aim of that scoping workshop would be to really understand the overall disease pathway and gain clinician insight on that. The second step is academic synthesis and modeling, and this is driven by the EAG. So the EAG at this case would, at this stage, would look at publicly available data, they would develop an analysis plan, and they would also develop a model. This model and analysis plan of the EAG would then go out for consultation, and companies at that stage would submit their evidence and also submit any comments that they have on the pathway, the analysis plan, or even how the EAG has assessed any publicly available data. After the EAG has reviewed all of this submission and kind of comments on their approach, they will develop an EAG base case. So the main change here is, instead of a company developing a model and coming up with a base case, the EAG is looking at all available data, taking the company's data, and then developing their base case. So when it goes to the committee meeting, it's on the one hand, the committee will be reviewing the ICEs and the decision making via the usual criteria, but the committee will this time also be making decisions on the overall assumptions on the disease pathway, and they will also publish a separate document called a pathways guidance. So I'm sure you can see that this is quite complex. It's also a big change from what NICE currently does. So there is limited available data on how this actually will work in practice, but there is a pilot going on at the moment. So the pilot is in renal cell carcinoma. So I've taken a screenshot there from the scoping workshop. And you can see there that NICE has essentially broken this down into the different stages of the disease, and then the A, B, C, D, E reflect the different nodes, so different kind of steps within the treatment pathway. During the scoping workshop, what NICE essentially did was go through each of those nodes in incredible detail with the clinicians to make sure they really understood the pathway and that the EAG could use that in their next step of model development. So it's important to note that at this stage for this particular pilot, there was only one technology that was relevant in or coming into RCC, but NICE still underwent this full approach of developing a full model, and then they would input the data specifically for cabozantinib. The committee meeting for this appraisal is actually happening today, so we don't have insight on what this committee meeting looks like or what the outcomes are, but it is something that will be available quite soon. Okay, so looking forward, NICE is continuing the PATT project, and these are kind of additional areas that they're looking at. So rapid entry to managed access. This is something that they're developing in collaboration with NHS England. It's being evaluated under what NICE calls its HTA lab, which is where it looks at innovative ways of kind of changing their processes. And the idea is that instead of needing to undergo a full usual STA process before you can be recommended into managed access, is there a way to identify which topics are most suitable for managed access and enable NICE to make that decision much sooner? So if products could go into managed access at an earlier stage, then this could essentially happen at marketing authorization or soon after, without a product needing to go through the full process and then undergoing managed access. The other two areas that NICE is looking at is high value steps. So if we just go to the previous slide. High value steps and products with many indications. So high value steps, this is a way of NICE looking through the appraisal process and seeing which steps are the most important ones, and seeing if there's any ways to be able to get to those stages quickly while still maintaining its rigor. And the second one, products with many indications, this is where NICE is looking at nivolumab, atezolizumab, all these products where there's many appraisals with the same technology. Is there a way to speed up decision making for these products? Both of these are still in very early stages of development, so there's very limited available publicly. And then just one kind of final slide on the changes. These changes of PATT are having wider implications at NICE. So NICE is also updating its key performance indicators to incorporate the proportionate approach. So instead of only looking at days between UK marketing authorization and guidance publication, NICE will now break down that KPI into looking at the separate targets for all topics, optimal topics, and divergent topics. And they also are saying that they'll further develop or adapt their business model to suit these proportionate approaches. They've also, in their business plan, indicated further changes that they want to complete within the 2023-2024 period. This includes a coordinated approach to stakeholder engagement. So instead of having separate Office of Market Access, scientific advice teams, they want to have one team at NICE that does all of NICE's industry engagement services. They also are looking into a new mechanism to scope and schedule topics based on priorities. And they're also looking at both the guidelines processes and technology appraisals processes to see if there's any way of aligning these methods and processes. Okay, so I'll now hand over back to Charlie to talk about the implications of this for NICE and industry.
Thanks, Fatima, and apologies, I think I was a bit trigger happy on some of the slide changes there. So yeah, I'm going to spend about a few minutes talking about what we think this means for industry and for NICE. So what does it mean for industry? Well, as I hope has been clear from what Fatima has said, there is quite a wide range of changes here, and the implications, there are quite a few of them. So clearly, this could result in faster access for topics or drugs that are routed down these new routes. As we'll talk to on a later slide, timelines are reduced for these appraisals by about 30 to 40%. It also means that there's greater flexibility. So NICE, as it's been obvious, there's now multiple routes. There's the cost comparison, the streamlined approach, the paired approach, the pathways approach in the longer term. So NICE is really taking a flexible approach here, and I think there's a lot companies can do to benefit from that. But it does mean that there's less predictability on timelines and processes now. So previously, most drugs would be going through a standard technology appraisal, the STA process, which took about 9 months or so, depending on the number of meetings. That offered predictability in terms of when you were likely to get reimbursement in the UK. Now there are multiple different routes that a drug could go down. Generally, these are likely to result in faster access, but at the same time, it means there's less predictability on exactly when you might get reimbursement in the UK, what the process is going to be. Do you need to develop a full submission, would an abbreviated submission be sufficient? How do you engage with NICE? What are the steps in the process? As Fatima said, there are changes to that and to who's making the decisions as to the routing here. So certainly less predictability and less control in some cases. NICE is making these decisions as to routing. Previously in the FDA process, the precursor to the cost comparison, the new cost comparison, the company could make the case for going down that route. Now it's more NICE is more heavily sort of controlling that. And also the pathways approach really, if it ends up coming to fruition, represents quite a radical change in how NICE are potentially looking at technologies. However, we do feel that the fact that you can get faster access through these processes by quite a substantial amount of time gives companies potentially greater incentives to reduce uncertainties early on, and also to potentially offer their best price early on. So there may be a sort of temptation to withhold a potential discount until NICE pushes back on certain issues. But if by offering a low ISA upfront, below around 10,000 or so, then there is potential for access several months faster than would have previously been possible. And I think the fact that nivolumab went through this streamlined approach is a good sign on that. As I pointed out in my slide right near the start, only one low ISA appraisal was ever done in 3 years, versus one already taking place effectively through this streamlined approach. So that's a good sign that potentially it could see more use. There's also potential for greater collaboration between companies in the context of paired appraisals. But clearly uncertainty and risk around some of these schemes, less so with some things like the cost comparison and the streamlined approach. I think there's less risk there. NICE would probably only route topics down these pathways if they were fairly certain they would get a positive outcome. Whereas the pathway approach, as I said, represents a substantial departure, and there's a lot of uncertainty and risk there. But also NICE is heavily engaging with industry on these changes and other stakeholders before they integrate them formally into their methods guide. From a NICE perspective, we tried to look at what we think this means for the various key rate limiting stakeholders in terms of delivering guidance. In terms of the cost comparison, we feel this is likely to be very effective, more so than the previous FTA, as the routing decision is made early on at scoping in the process. So the company makes a reduced submission, so reduced company requirements. EAG doesn't have to do as in-depth a critique, so reduced EAG requirements. The decision will be made by a subset of the committee, and the technical team will likely have less work to do as well. The streamlined approach has some of these advantages, but it doesn't have the advantage of the reduced submission. The decision is made after the EAG report is received by NICE, so the company still needs to make the full submission and the EAG do the full critique, but there are potentially savings later on. Technical engagement. This is likely to make time savings within NICE, so that the technical team has to prepare for technical engagement, liaise with stakeholders, produce extra slides and things like that for the committee meetings. It also will reduce the burden for companies and the EAG in terms of companies no longer having to respond to issues raised by the EAG, potentially generating new evidence or providing new evidence, and the EAG will no longer have to critique that new the new arguments made by the company. So although we've put a sort of no impact, there is some potential impact during the process. Paired appraisals, we see some savings in terms of the EAG and the technical team time at NICE, but we don't think that the time saved by looking at 2 appraisals side by side in committee will be enough to fit in another meeting, which is really key in terms of fitting in committee slots and increasing capacity there. And the pathway appraisals, well, this is very uncertain. There's a high upfront cost or requirements in terms of the EAG, in terms of developing models, analysis plans, these sorts of things. But in the long term, once these have all been developed, there's potential for maybe substantial resource savings. So NICE has predicted that phase 1 of PATT will increase its capacity by 17%, which is slightly short of its original target of 20%. So as I've said, technical engagement will result in some operational efficiencies that are challenging to quantify. The pathway appraisal approach results in long-term efficiencies, but in my mind, there's quite some uncertainty there around what it will end up looking like. I think there are issues to be ironed out with a disease area model in terms of getting companies all to agree on the model structure. What happens when you get a new appraisal coming in that is now, you use the same model and it then shows that a previously appraised drug is no longer cost effective. What happens then? So some uncertainty there. In terms of cost comparisons, these do seem to be working. Timelines are reduced by 45%. And resources have been reduced internally by NICE. And the same thing for streamlined appraisals. As could be predicted, the time saving is less because the decision is made later in the process. But again, these do seem to be working. And finally, paired appraisals, potentially smaller operational efficiencies to be gained there, but also potentially better alignment in committee decision making as well. So that's those are all the slides we've prepared on this this topic. We hope it's been useful. Fatima's answered some questions that we've received during the presentation in the chat. Are there any other questions at all? If you just pop them in the chat, we can see if we can answer them in the last few minutes.
Yeah, I think we've got 3 questions there already. So one of the questions are around cost comparisons. So yes, they do assume efficacy equivalence in cost comparisons. So ITCs could be presented, but essentially the idea is that these products would be considered equivalent in their efficacy. The second question is around pathways. I think that's a really good question. I don't think NICE has publicly revealed all on how companies will be able to challenge the model that the EAG develops. We know that after the EAG model is developed on a pathways appraisal, it does go out to consultation and companies can comment, and that stakeholders or kind of breadth of companies that can comment will be quite broad to enable anybody in that disease area to have a say on that model. But all the details on that are not yet finalized. And then the other question is, are the timelines for manufacturer submission the same post-scoping for cost comparison versus STA? And to my knowledge, the timelines between the invitation to participate and the submission needed would be the same regardless of the routing. But the submission itself would be much more simple for a company doing cost comparison versus a full STA submission.
Yeah. And certainly in the old FTA process, there are some instances where companies didn't even need to provide an economic model. So it's likely to be quite substantially reduced, the requirements there. Yep. Great. Well, thank you for your questions. They were, I think they were really great questions to answer and very pertinent. So I'm just going to wrap things up by mentioning that we are going to a couple of conferences recently, sorry, not recently, in the near future. If you do want to come and meet us there, we're going to the World Orphan Drug Congress, and we're also attending the NICE conference as well, and ISPOR later in the month in Copenhagen, which is what this slide alludes to. And we have a number of posters there, one on NICE itself, so looking at how the severity modifier in particular, this was introduced in the research methods update, how has that been implemented so far? The answer is not very frequently, but we're presenting several of these posters, so feel free again to pop over to our stand and we'd be happy to meet you there. I also just want to say that we have been recording the webinar today, so if you know of any colleagues who may be interested in it, it should be available from around the middle of next week. And if you do think of any other questions on the back of this webinar, just let us know. You can drop Fatima or me an email, and we can see if we can get back to you. Great. So I think all that remains to be said is thank you so much for attending today and for your concentration and your questions. And we hope it's been useful. And yes, feel free to get in contact if you have anything else you'd like to discuss. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.